Hello and welcome to Insight. India has improved its performance in the Global Competitive Index, where it rose 3 ranks from the 44th position in 2015 to 41st in 2016. India has been unable to claim the 35th position achieved a few years ago in 2012, despite the strenuous efforts made by the NDA government. The ranking clearly hints that the higher consumer price inflation, lower public spending on education, tax revenue collection and ailing exports proved to be biggest drags on the country's economic competitiveness. However, India's performance on other fronts like current account balance, government budget deficit, tax evasion, corruption and bribery and ease of doing business have helped India improve its rank on the global index. So what does this majorly indicate about the weaknesses and the strengths of our policies and approach towards the major areas of growth? Do the figures suggest that other nations have been able to roll out policies to improve competitiveness much faster than us? If yes, then what is the way forward? We discuss it all in Insight today. So is the economy really doing better? We are going to talk about that, but first a look at this report.
India has improved its performance on the Global Competitiveness Index. In the ranking issued by the Switzerland-based research group, India has moved 3 notches higher to 41st position. It was at 44 in 2015 and 2014. The ranking is based on 340 criteria and 4 categories that includes economic performance, government efficiency, business efficiency, infrastructure. Responses from a survey of more than 5,000 business executives were also examined. On the Prosperity Index, India got its best ranking, 53rd for governance, a sub-index which measures effective and accountable government, fair elections and political participation as well as rule of law. It performed worst for social capital, social cohesion and community networks, for which it ranked 129th. The competitiveness rankings of many Asian countries, including China, have shown a marked decline, though it still remains much above India at the 25th position in 2016. Taiwan, Malaysia and Indonesia all suffered significant falls from their 2015 positions. At the top spot for competitiveness is Hong Kong, while Switzerland is in second position. The US, which was at the helm in 2015, fell to the third position.
And to discuss more on what these figures really suggest about India as well as other growing economies, I have with me in the studio Ms. Maithili Bhusnurmat, the consulting editor with the Economic Times, Professor Sudipto Mandal, Emeritus Professor with NIPFP, and Professor N. Chandramohan, who's an economist. Welcome to the program. I'd like to start with you, Maithili. How should one read these figures? What is there for India here to look out for?
Well, I think the first thing, Charlie, one must take these numbers with a pinch of salt for a number of reasons. It's based on the survey method, and the survey method, particularly given the kind of size of the Indian economy, becomes very difficult because unless a sample is chosen properly, scientifically, it doesn't give you a very good analysis. If you look at the ease of doing business, which the World Bank does, initially used to do it only in Bombay, and based on just the survey of one city, they used to come to these conclusions about how India ranked in the ease of doing business. Likewise with the competitiveness index also, the survey-based method is always to be taken with a pinch of salt, number one. Number two, how does one really define competitiveness? If you even look at this, it's constructed on 340 criteria.
That's right.
Based on 4 principal subcomponents, things like government efficiency, business efficiency. Now, how do you measure efficiency? You can measure economic performance, you get a GDP number. Of course, a lot of people will question our GDP numbers and the methodology, but at least it is a number. How do you measure efficiency? So there are a number of questions, but having said that, one shouldn't rubbish it altogether. The fact remains that India is not remotely as competitive as we need to be in a globalized economy. So to the extent that we've moved up marginally, yes, there's something to be happy about, but to the extent that we're still way below where we should be, way below where we need to be, and way below our potential, I think it should put us on watch to see what can we do to improve our position.
Okay, that's a very interesting point that you've made. You know, the basic factors on the basis of which these rankings are being, these rankings have been made. Well, Professor Mandal, the fact that economic performance is something we can really find it in numbers, we can look at different sectors, the overall growth figures, and maybe we'll get some idea about the economic performance. So could be even about infrastructure. But about business efficiency and government efficiencies, these are majorly to do with the steps a particular government takes or a country as a whole takes in these directions. What does it really say about India's position rising at least 3 notches, but largely how would you assess that?
Yeah, if you put this in perspective, you yourself mentioned that actually we were number 35
in 2012.
4 years ago.
Yeah.
And then we went little down, especially towards that last couple of years of the UPA government. Everybody talks about paralysis and so on. So basically, 2 notches improvement is no big deal. I would read this as statistically as being where we were, which is not to say that efforts are not being made, but I think the hype has been more than the achievements, so expectations have been built up, and I think there is a problem about managing these expectations, because you don't get, the government is a big behemoth and you don't turn things around overnight. It takes time. I think the message is going around that we do need to make our processes more efficient and so on. Some things have been done. It's not as though there's been no improvement. But before you see discrete change for substantial kind, I think we need to give it more time.
Okay, let's look at the improvements as well as the drags, Professor Chandramohan, and the fact that, going by what it seems, there are some of the improvements on certain fronts: the ease of doing business, which this government keeps talking about, tax evasion, current account balance, the budget deficit, and exchange rate stability. Do you see them as the drivers here, which has helped India here to rise above a certain level?
Actually, since you are taking the basis of comparison from 2012 onwards, if you take it, the improvement is largely in these factors: the economic efficiency, economic performance parameters, in which there has been a consistent improvement in India's position to number 12 or 16 in the current 2016 thing on economic performance. So that's from 2012. There's a very sharp, consistent improvement in India's ranking. But that's not the case in all the other criteria, like government efficiency or business efficiency. The worst is the infrastructure part.
Yep.
In fact, there we are nowhere. In fact, if you take all these 4 points of time for comparison, actually it's only in the economic thing that you see a consistent improvement.
That's right, and there is in fact decline in infrastructure from 53rd position in 2012 to
58. So in that sense, it's overall, it's something like a human development index, you see. It seems to be very sharply correlated with our performance in income growth, in some sense, so if you're having bullish growth and things like that, it does favorably impact some of these rankings in some form or the other. So in some sense, we are only riding on that. There's a lot of improvement in the other 3 areas, and IMD itself is very sharply critical of what our expenditures on education and health and things like that. So social infrastructure is the worst. That's why we are lagging. In fact, it's not out of 120 countries, out of only 62 countries we are talking about.
That's right.
And we are almost bottom of the heap there, 58. So this is the situation. So the improvement is largely, the silver lining is largely in the economic.
But would you agree with what Maithili also said, that it's very difficult to calculate government efficiency, business efficiency and things like that, because these are reflected in some certain other aspects, but how to calculate them?
Okay, now the thing is, let me put it this way to you. I'll take off from where she was saying, see, one major limitation of these indicators is, maybe the small size of sample or whatever in surveys. And she pointed out very correctly that till recently, now it used to be, doing business used to be largely centered on Mumbai, and now they've included Delhi and things like that. So there was a limitation. But point is, actually, the real indicator there is actually the survey method. The World Bank does not publicize it as much, but actually they have something called the enterprise surveys, in which they have again a very decent sample, and they actually ask the experience of each company and how long has it taken for you in these concerned parameters. So you get a very different picture from what the doing business indicator, We may talk preen ourselves that we have improved 12 rankings and things like that. But actually, SMEs and things like that, they consistently face a very hostile environment for doing business on the ground. In fact, the latest numbers on MSME sectors is the worst actually. The credit has contracted, and they are actually powering a lot of our industrial growth. So in some sense, you take it. So you just have to take them at face value. You can't keep doing in some sense, it's not any ground for triumphalism that others have declined and we have gained a few this thing.
Right.
To take the overall picture, it
Right.
is we have a lot of ground to cover.
But Maithili, if one has to read it, because the moment corruption, bribery, tax evasion, bureaucracies work, all that is scanned, how do you look at that? Because on the governance front, there had been some measures which have been taken, some important legislations in fact have been cleared by the parliament. Absolutely. So those things, do you think they reflect largely in this growth in India's
See, I think any of these changes, particularly in a democracy, it takes time before it gets translated onto the ground. So whatever the government has done, in fact the India government has tried, particularly with the use of technology, to remove the interface between the people and the authorities, as it were, and also to put many things online. So that has really removed a great deal of scope for corruption. It's also made it possible for government to function more efficiently. But these things, there is a certain inertia to them. So it will take time before they translate on the ground, and there's a great deal still to be done, because even though one might accept that the big time corruption that we talked about under the previous government definitely seems to have come down, at the smaller level of corruption and in terms of road challans, in terms of everyday interaction, those still continue, and those will be an issue, particularly as far as businesses are concerned. In fact, Chandramohan talked about the ease of doing business, how we've moved up 12 ranks, but actually what has happened is that the entire size of the number of countries changed. So actually we moved up only 4 ranks. So there are a lot of these finer nuances also which one looks at these competitiveness indices or any league tables, because apart from the IMD, the Switzerland numbers that we're discussing now, the World Economic Forum also has a competitiveness index, and there in fact we show a very different picture.
Right.
But having said all that, one could quibble about the finer points, but the fact remains, as I said, that as Chandramohan and Sudipta also said, we have a long way to go, particularly if we want to compete in a global world, because today we can no longer continue as we were in the pre-liberalization days and say, okay, we are fine with our ambassadors and our premier Padminis. Today we have to compete with the best in the world. So if you want to compete with the best in the world, then you have to be as competitive, because every global consumer has a choice of buying your product or a product from any other country. So why should he buy an Indian product unless it is the best in the world?
That's right.
And that is where I think we really need to focus, particularly if we're talking about things like Make in India. Government has set so much store by Make in India. Now, even if you make in India, if you make a third-rate product, nobody's going to buy it. So Make in India has to be accompanied
and
by
the fact that
make
the
the best.
MSMEs,
Yes,
what you
make
just
the
said,
best in
that's-
India.
yeah.
Just make
Yes.
excuse me. Please carry on.
So that's one of the critical things. But Professor Mandal, the fact that infrastructure happens to be one of the areas where there was a lot of talk that we need to push in the investments, we need to see that a lot of those projects which were lying pending, they should be speeded up and things like that. But that happens to be one of the areas where we seem not to be doing, of course, according to what the world expects us to do.
A couple of things. First of all, as all of us have been saying, there's a long way to go, and certainly in infrastructure there's a long way to go. We started off with a very poor base and it continues that way. Second thing is, again, as both Maithili and Chandramohan have said, these samples are very small and one shouldn't set too much store by these things. What I would look at much more is it affecting investment? Is the private sector investing, is putting its money where its mouth is and so on? That hasn't happened yet. But it has to be said that this government is very focused on infrastructure. It has been spending a lot of effort on trying to, speed up some of these stalled projects and so on. I think that is one area where they're actually quite serious about it. And we look at budget allocations, I'm talking about public investment now, huge increases in spending on railways, on
That's
roads,
right.
etc.
Roads and highways, etc.
Again, all this will take some time before you start seeing results on the ground. But this is one area, the only area, in fact, I would say, of all these, where the government is really serious and is not just slogans.
But interestingly, Professor Mandal, for some time now, the moment this investment in infrastructure in other places, we have seen an increase in that. Simultaneously, there's been call of increasing the public spending on education and health. While because the government is also focused on creating more and more jobs, skilled laborers, entrepreneurs. But what about spending on education, which is really very, very low? So the fact that this report also highlights that, that line, how do you look at that? Because after all, these reports only give us an opportunity to look at the weaknesses and the strengths.
You're absolutely right. In fact, on your channel before, we've discussed it. If infrastructure or its focus in infrastructure is one of the big success stories of this government, one of its biggest failures is the lack of substance and lack of commitment on the education front. You can go on talking about skill development till the cows come home, but if you're not going to improve your base of basic and primary education and so on, people are not going to be able to pick up the skills. So that is the biggest failing, and both critics of this government as well as its well-wishers keep telling them, listen, you need to get your focus on this thing, it has to happen. And I'm afraid, you talk about this Gujarat model and so on, now you're seeing this in a, in a national scale. The biggest failing in Gujarat is very good on infrastructure, but look at their,
That's partly because we focus on physical infrastructure, on social infrastructure, which includes not just education but also health.
That's right.
So unfortunately, we are not looking at the social infrastructure, which is so critical, and we're focusing on
this is the biggest failing, I would say, and that is where the government needs to get its act together.
And interestingly, it's about health and environment and education. Now, that's where I find a very interesting link even on environment, because, I mean, let's look at it broadly, and you'll find that India also faces challenges on that front. So, Professor Chandramohan,
in fact, the triad you mentioned, besides education, the biggest lacuna as well in terms of any decisive interventions to step up expenditures beyond that 1% of GDP is in the area of public health. So that remains still at a very, very low level. So in some sense, you want Skill India, you want to increase, upgrade people's capabilities, and yet the base is very fragile in a sense of providing education, this thing, and as well as health, access to health, public health. So there is a big problem in social infrastructure, and that is highlighted very sharply in this report. So this is the underbelly of the infrastructure part, where our rankings are very low, largely because of this area.
Fine. And there are other aspects too which we need to look at. Time for a very quick break now. And Insight, please stay tuned for more on the other side of this break. Well, welcome back to Insight. In Insight today, we are talking about the data released by International Institute for Management and Development of World Competitiveness Center on India's global competitiveness and the impact and the indications that it really gives about Indian economy at large. Maithili, the fact that it also indicates that the taming of the consumer price inflation has been one of the problem areas for our economy. Well, how do you look at the measures on that front that we've taken?
Well, on the inflation front, it certainly has been a success story. We've brought down the inflation rate quite remarkably. But a great deal of the credit for that really has to be to the collapse in global commodity prices. That has really helped us hugely. Along with that, there were some measures by the government, particularly in the food front, better management of the food economy, and some measures by the Reserve Bank of India. So this is clearly one outstanding example of what can be done if we really wish to do it. We work together and we get a little bit of luck from Lady Luck, a hand from Lady Luck, as it were. So inflation certainly has been a success story, and to that extent it does improve our competitiveness. But to offset that, I think our exchange rate policy has been quite a disaster. The rupee has been grossly overvalued for a long, long time. It does not reflect the inflation differentials, and that has really hurt our exports, because for 17 months, consecutive months, we've seen export growth decline, and that cannot be sustained really for a country where, especially when global demand is already collapsing. So the only edge that you can get is from your exchange rate policy. So if your exchange rate policy is flawed, we're losing out. And to that extent, it really also hurts not just exporters themselves, but also the entire growth story. Had exports done well, I'm sure the GDP number that you saw for the last quarter of 7.9 could have crossed to over 8%. So I think there's been a story of pluses and minuses. It's always, you can never have the glass entirely full, but to the extent that we're edging up, it's a little past the halfway mark. I think we are not quite getting there, but certainly improving our position, I would say, Shalini.
But you see, the fact that exports, as you said, is one of the areas where we haven't, we have been completely disappointed, because there could be reasons external in nature. But Professor Mandal, looking at the ailing exports, what do you think that the government could have done here in this direction?
No, I actually think that the collapse of our exports for 15, 16 months consecutively is a consequence of the recession that you're facing, or certainly very low rates of growth in some of our major markets, including now China. I mean, China is now a big trade partner for us, but even their growth has been faltering. So I think the explanation of that is largely that. I mean, but yes, we could have taken measures to try and increase our trade share even within this depressed environment, and that has not happened. Our trade share is very small and it has actually declined. Part of it may be the exchange rate issue that Maithili is mentioning, but first of all, there has been, at least nominal exchange rate has been depreciating. The real effective exchange rate varies a little bit, but basically it's been relatively stable, I think, the real effective exchange rate. But there are other problems. Again, I mean, if the turnaround time for our ships, for instance, ports and so on, again we get back to that infrastructure constraint, that if you can get your supplies from some other country at shorter notice efficiently, why would you waste your time with India? I think those are areas in which the government can certainly do a lot to improve. But otherwise, until the overall global environment improves, I think we should stop thinking about export as the basis of high growth.
But Professor Chandramohan, is there something that can be done now, at least to fix the problem in the exports sector?
What can you do? What is desirable is one thing, what is feasible is another. So right now, when you're having a situation where global trade itself is growing slower than the GDP growth, that's quite an interesting time. Normally it used to be 2:1 type of ratio. That is not obtaining anymore. So where is the buoyancy in the global market? So you'll have to concentrate, if you want to give a South-South perspective, like step up our efforts to go to Africa and things like that. But that's not going to bail us out. You really need the big ticket markets like China and all to look up to have for our exports as a whole to lift up, like even America, for instance, or the advanced markets. So we have to step up these efforts. And right now, the Prime Minister is going to Washington, and actually, not so long ago, one ambassador American ambassador to India, Robert Blackwell, he said American exports to India and things like that are flat as a chapati, So in some sense, that was a situation in the late 90s and things like that. Things have considerably improved. But there's a tremendous upside if we get closer to the US as a strategic partner to see that it reflects itself in terms of higher trade between us. For that to happen, of course, there has to be a step up in investments. We are also investing very aggressively in the US. The US is also investing. If the roadblocks to business improve, there could be a basis for larger volumes to.
But there has been a rise in the investments that we have seen.
Not in a sense that if you were to look at it from, let me put it this way to you. There is no doubt about it that the largest, if you take the Indian equity inflows coming.
That's right.
US is number one in terms of, even more than Mauritius. In fact, they have been the one using the Mauritius route to invest in India. That's not that. But you take, for instance, the big ticket concerns of US investors. Every one of them have some concern in India. Whether it is the Amazons, whether it is any of the tech people, every one of them have some concerns or the other in India, which was expressed by the governor, Indian non-resident governor, Nikki Haley, like saying that the general perception in American business is that you have to be close to power to get things done. Now, things like that. So they want to see radical improvements in conditions for doing business before the big guns start rolling out, in the big ticket investments start rolling in from the US. They're waiting for that to happen. So in some sense, so that's a work in progress. Much needs to be done to improve that. But believe me, once that happens, the basis for a step up in our exports to US and things like that, that's a realistic basis to expect a considerable upside.
I would just go back to the question of exports. The fact is that yes, what they both said is entirely right, that global demand is depressed. But the fact is that even in these depressed conditions, countries like Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, all competitors have increased their share. So it is not as if nothing could be done. I think on the exchange rate policy, we have clearly not done enough. And that, I think, is unfortunately something that the government has not paid enough attention to, because I think somehow there is this view that, a strong currency is a sign of your macho, it's a strength of the economy. But unless your exchange rate reflects your macroeconomic fundamentals, and the fact is that even with the success that we've had on the inflation front, our inflation rate is much higher than what it is in competitor countries. So I think the fact that your exchange rate is not properly aligned with your macroeconomic fundamentals has hurt our exports. And in a democracy, I emphasize that this means distress in terms of human lives. In many of our export centers like Muradabad, Trichy, those kind of places, Tirupur, people have actually lost their jobs. And that is something I think that the government must pay heed to, particularly if it can be done by doing something to exchange rate, not by doing competitive devaluation as China used to do earlier. And entirely granted that the export-led model of growth is out. We cannot follow the routes that China did earlier. Right. But we cannot ignore the potential of exports also. So I think somewhere we have to draw a line between what is seen as macho and what is really required in terms of growth. So I think that is something we really need to keep in mind.
When the bodies like IMF, World Bank say that India happens to be one of the bright spots, how attractive has India's economy been for the investors, globally? The fact that we have seen some sort of rise, comfortable figures there in the investments that is coming from abroad. But otherwise, on the ground, how do you evaluate this?
No, if you look at the FDI numbers, foreign direct investment as against portfolio investment, we are completely dismissed, because portfolio money is easy come, easy go. So what we really need to focus on is foreign direct investment. And there certainly the last fiscal has been an outstandingly good year, particularly if you look at the past numbers of the previous years. And I think here the IMF is entirely right in saying India is a bright spot and one of the best spots for destination, for investment, sweets, whatever, So the fact remains that if you look at global growth, where else is growth happening on this scale? Where else is there demand? How many televisions will you sell to an American household? They have more televisions than they can possibly see. Whereas India is a market where there's a huge demand still needing to be satiated in terms of cars, in terms of mobile, except for mobile telephony, which perhaps we've got almost every Indian owning one, if not more, one mobile phone. But there's a huge pent-up demand, which income levels don't permit people to buy at the moment. So for every foreign company, the question is not whether, how easy is it to do business in India. The question is, can you afford not to be in India? You can't. And as the example of Suzuki has shown, I mean, they've gone through ups and downs, but today the Indian market contributes the highest amount of profit to the entire Suzuki bottom line than any other market in the world, including Japan. So Suzuki, I think, is an outstanding example of what foreign companies can get if they stay in India. It's not easy to do business, but nor is it easy to do business in any of the emerging markets. It's a question of degree, more or less. Question is, can you afford not to be here? And that, I think, is the reason why almost every foreign company, particularly automobile companies, including the top-end ones, are here in India.
So there is this continuous obsession with how the Chinese also perform on all these fronts, and that's where you see that China, of course, remains one of those major destinations for foreign direct investments. It happens to be one of those spots. But Professor Mandal, looking at the number of policy schemes that have come out, the talk now and then of ease of doing business, ensuring that India becomes at least an attractive spot, and also keeping in mind what Maithili said, that people and investors globally cannot afford to not invest in India. Looking at all of that, how do you evaluate our situation? Have we changed from where we stood, let's say, a year ago?
Yeah, I think the first thing to look at is FDI. I agree with Maithili that, portfolio investment is hot money, easy come, easy go. You should look at FDI. But on FDI also, and there has been an increase, but the definition of FDI, what is treated as FDI, has also been corrupted a little bit. It's not been the same as how we defined FDI 10 years ago. So a lot of this is what some of us would say is actually portfolio money and not really FDI. Anyway, that being said, let's, I think it's fair to say some of it has gone up. There is a lot of round tripping, but there is also round tripping in China.
Okay.
So both these countries have all sorts of smart people finding various ways to do business, if I may put it that way. But all that being said, it is true, as Maithili is saying, that there is no way that these two countries were just so big. Size really trumps everything else. I mean, 1.2 billion there, 1.23 billion here. No serious global business can ignore these markets, and they will be here. But how much they will be here is a big question. I mean, look at Apple, Amazon, they've all been coming,
Yeah.
but how many of them have yet transferred their converted into investment? Not one. Because they're also waiting to see what actually happens on the ground in terms of the actual easing of doing business, so apart from the sloganeering. And here, there's a big risk of complacency in this, can they afford not to be here? Everybody knows it, so do our bureaucrats. And there has been over time this attitude, oh, they will have to come here, where else will they go? And that has led to some extent to this business of, not being focused on trying to, get our act together on making India a really good place to do business. And it has hurt us. I mean, Maithili was talking about the fact that despite a global, depressed market, a country like Bangladesh, Vietnam, I think another one, who actually managed to increase their share within the depressed market. We haven't.
So those are the areas. But Professor Chandramohan, on the ease of doing business front, if one has to just bring all those things together on the same table and see as to what all the government has done in order to ensure that the business doing can become easier in the country, and has it really led to some sort of a pepping of the investor sentiment even within the country?
To answer the latter part of your question, if it is private Indian investor sentiment, that is not yet in evidence. But we are talking about foreign investor sentiment, and we are talking about ease of doing business in this criteria, according to this type of thing. So in some sense, if you were to look at it from that point of view, what is it that in some sense needs to be done to, so far the government's focus has been taking it online and making it easy. They are very desperate to get into the top 50 rankings of this World Bank doing business. They want to break into that. So they, in fact, the World Bank team is coming next month or this month to, and it's certainly some of the changes they they want them to be reflected in radical improvements in India's positioning. So, how many steps does it take to start a business? Like, how many steps does it take to close a business? The typical way, the bank, things like that. So they're going about it in that sort of way.
Yeah.
Now, if you actually were to ask a MSME businessman, does he see anything improving in the conditions for his doing business on the ground and things like that, you will see a very different connect altogether. If you were to ask even a private investor, like we were mentioning about Apple and things like that, you might have noticed the Apple CEO did not announce any manufacturing plans in India, though people were egging him on to announce some plans to make in India. He hasn't. He was there was just almost like a fact-finding type of this type of thing. So in some sense, there is, while it is true that we are in some sense one of the bright spots or sweet spots in the world, the fact is they are in no great hurry to offload their write checks for their investments in India as yet. So there is a hell of a lot of limitation. And one aspect of all these rankings and things like that don't capture, it's like take the environment of taxation, for instance. Now that's an area which is a great source of concern. Now if you were to ask me a blunt question, how much investment has not come because of our tax thing, I won't be able to answer that question. But every single foreign investor community or rather association has said it very clearly to this government that we are concerned that certain things remain on the books. You may say you don't want to introduce retrospective taxation, but it is still there in the books. Notices are still being given to these companies and things like that. So in some sense, taxation, that environment of taxation, it's not yet been clarified for even the sunrise industries like e-commerce, for instance. So it's a source of quite a lot of concern amongst foreign investors about the tax environment as such here.
Okay.
So if we were to take it that point of view, let's even talk about the issue of what Nikki Haley was talking about you have to be close to power to get things done. The feedback from the MSME type of businessman, big ticket corruption may have gone. There is no such evidence of it. But these people have to routinely pay money. I mentioned at the start of the program that one of the most insightful of the World Bank surveys is the enterprise surveys. And the most recent one of them has repeatedly hammered home, contrary to all the improvements in conditions for doing business. To get an electricity connection, you have to pay a bribe. Every single businessman has complained about that.
Okay.
So there is nothing you can get, even an import license or the number of days to reduce import documentation.
So there
I
is
would not quite agree.
there
I
is
think
some sort of a reduction, but not to the extent.
Not
Maybe
to the extent.
I'll have to take a very quick break. Maybe after the break we can hear your views also on this issue. Time for a very quick break now in Insight. Welcome back. In Insight today, we are talking about India's performance on the competitiveness index. Okay, Maithili, you were saying something before the break.
Before the break, Chandran was talking about how the government is very keen to move into the top 50 ranks with the ease of doing business. But there are ways and ways of moving up. If you look at it as ticking boxes, which unfortunately is what we tend to do at times, like the bankruptcy code, for instance. One of the questions is, does the country have a bankruptcy code? So now you pass the act, tick, so automatically you move up. But has that bankruptcy code, is it going to get translated into action? Do you have the necessary infrastructure in place? You don't. So all that you have is a beautiful code which reads very well and no infrastructure to support it. So it makes no difference whatsoever to how quickly you can actually, proceed with the bankruptcy and banks can recover their money.
It just improves the sentiment.
It's something on paper. So that is what we need to guard against. And we don't just do these checking boxes business, but we actually do translate it into action. That's my first where I want to take off from Chandran. The other thing that he talked about was retrospective taxation. Now, however, and against the grain it goes, I'm very strongly in favor of taxing multinationals depending on where their source of income arises. If the profits arise from business in India, you jolly well pay your taxes in India. And we get all het up and we bat on behalf of the MNCs about retrospective taxation. But what has the UK done? What is France doing now? They're getting companies like Google and all to pay for their back taxes. Because all these companies, what do? Through a clever fudging, as it were, quote unquote, and routing transactions through Ireland, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, you name it, they just escape paying tax. Even in the case of Vodafone and Hutchison, even though the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of Vodafone, the fact remains that they made their money in India. Just by putting that transaction, routing it through somewhere else, you didn't pay your taxes. Now, I think that is very unfair. And all over the world, governments are realizing, but when a US government does it, when a British government does it, when a French government does it, no multinational will raise cane. But when India does it, you do it because you think you can arm twist the Indian government. So I think the fundamental principle of taxation is wherever you are generating profits, wherever you are generating income, you pay taxes there. And I think that is a fundamental principle that we must accept. And if the multinationals think they can arm twist us, we should tell them, no, take your business elsewhere. Likewise with Apple phones, if there's a 30% local sourcing requirement, do it. If you cannot do it, go elsewhere. They'll come back if you stand stern. Their act is, let's see who blinks first. And India being a weak third world country, noisy democracy, you have as many people batting on behalf of MNCs.
So there's these
absolutely,
perceptions are
they're trying to
still
push and see whether the government will back down. Why don't you pay your taxes? If this is a requirement, do it. Malaysia has a Bhumiputra policy. And don't foreigners go there? They do invest. But the thing is, you want to see how weak, quote unquote, is the government. Can we get our way? Why not?
I want to also understand this, Professor Mandal, the fact that there has been a lot of effort and this has been said that the competitiveness among states, the government is focusing a lot on that, so that it's the investments from any corner is not just limited to a few states, but it spreads out throughout the country. Has it really happened? And how proactive do you think states have been on this front?
Yeah, I was in fact going to raise that issue, but before I get there, I think it's quite important to make a comment about what Maithili just said. I would completely agree that multinationals do all kinds of,
Fudging. We won't call it
fudging
that.
to avoid taxes. They do it all over the world.
Yep.
Some governments are able to go after them and they pay and so on. On that, in principle, completely. But in this case, and that needs another program we can't discuss in detail, it was a different matter that you changed a law. You changed provisions of a law and then said that this is going to apply from before.
Yeah, but you changed it after you lost. It's a question of interpretation.
No, that's true. You lost.
And then you changed.
Then you changed.
They should not have
that
done
is
that.
what
Yeah.
they should not have done.
That they should
And that is why this present
need more
government is
clarity
also
on this.
uncomfortable about it, but is so far not been able to fix it. Otherwise, I agree with you that all multinational do this business of trying to shift tax
be
liability,
taxed.
etc., and you have to be tough with them. But yes, it's true, we are trying to attract them, so sometimes we are also soft with them. But moving on, I think that's quite important. We're saying that a lot of what is this ease of business, doing business and so on, has really very little to do with jurisdiction of the union government. It has a lot to do with the jurisdiction of state governments and in fact municipalities and so on further down the line. And we have not paid enough attention to that. The World Bank actually produced something called ease of doing business in the states, but it was not their actual ease of doing business. This was something that Mr. Amitav Kant, then in the Industry Ministry, had sent out a questionnaire, and in the World Bank kind of endorsed it and things like that. And as it happened, Jharkhand came up as one of the top rankers. Why?
Right.
I also do this work on ranking state governance performance, and I talked to the World Bank Reserve about it, and he explained that Jharkhand, young state, young bureaucrat, this and that, it's just that they took the questionnaire seriously and sent replies. So they got a high ranking. Maharashtra bureaucrats couldn't be bothered, and they got a low rank.
And these replies were all from
It was
bureaucrats,
as
so obviously going to say it's very
trivial as
good.
that. And this points to something else that Maithili was saying, that whenever you have any ticking box kind of thing, people are interested. They will do what is required to get your box properly ticked. It doesn't mean things will happen on the ground. It's not just a problem with this competitiveness, with any index, any that kind of rating system, in whichever sphere you want to talk about, this is a problem that you will face.
In terms of figures, one would say that there are very encouraging signs. In fact, today's newspapers, their headlines also suggest that at 7.6%, India is still continuing and it will grow as at a faster pace than, of course, China. As I said, the obsession with China. But the challenges, if I ask you, this would be in fact the last question that I'll have to ask to all three of you.
Yeah.
Professor Chandramohan, where exactly do you think we need to really focus if we have to sustain this growth, at the same time ensure that the fruits of this growth can be, accessed by all?
The biggest challenge, if you ask me, since you mentioned the growth number, the biggest challenge even of that growth number is to make it sustainable with stepping up of investment. Now, the investment, gross fixed capital formation, is that is the dismal part of this situation. So, we have been talking about multinationals and all that type of stuff. Actually, our people are not investing. Now, FDI is just a small fraction of the total investment activity in the country. It's not going to power our growth rates. Main thing is a step up in the domestic investment.
Okay.
And that is the challenge. Now, reviving that is the key to whichever comparison you want to make, with which country you want to overtake or not. But point is, this number will stick, will become sustainable if it's backed up with investment. So that would be my quick answer to your thing about challenges.
Okay, Professor Mandal?
Since Chandramohan referred to this business of taking over, and as all this, jingoists are going to town about India now being the fastest growth rate, we should remember that India is 1/5 the size of China. So, even a 1% lower growth rate in China, they're still adding 4 times as much in absolute terms to their GDP compared to us. So, for us to be able to add as much value as China in a year, we need to grow 5 times as fast as them. So the little at the decimal point margin is nothing to, you know, sort of go to town about.
And there are so many complexities in India, basically. I mean, compare it with China and you'd
Yeah.
find that it is
So-
going to be a
so-
very difficult
yeah.
task.
So that being said, now on your key issue, I agree with Chandramohan that investments so on are very, but that is something the government is focused on. It's trying to work on various fronts to try and get that. It hasn't yet happened because businessmen are hard-nosed guys. Unless they're sure that, you know, they will get returns on investment, they're not going to put money. But the government is trying to do that. What it is not focused on, and to me that's a very big issue we talked about earlier, is its lack of interest in seriously addressing social services, education, health. You know, we talk about Swachh Bharat, but you look around Delhi itself, have you seen an improvement in the past 2 years? No. Because that's the change of culture that we need. You know, people need to think in terms of being clean. So those are the soft areas, if you will, but they are very critical areas where this government is not focused and needs to focus.
Maithili?
Well, I entirely endorse what both of them have said. I think one area that we also need to focus on very critically is employment. Given the large
That's
numbers we're adding to our population and in the working age group every year, I think that's one thing we really need to consider very seriously. So I think that is one thing the government should also focus on. And remember, when you're talking about ease of doing business, competitiveness, another thing that is very important, I think, is judicial reform. Because the basic transaction in any business transaction is the sanctity of the contract. If you cannot enforce your contracts, then no business is worth doing. So I think that is something for which really government must do something about judicial reforms.
Okay, fine. And there are some pending reforms in some other areas too, GST being one of them, land reforms being the others. So of course, more clarity is also required on that front. So this index seriously gives us an opportunity to analyze as to where exactly our policies and approach should be headed in the near future. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining me here. That's all for today in Insight. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.